Hello, and welcome to this edition of Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. My name is Nicole Yearwood, and I am founder of Educated Voter. Today, we will be discussing the results of the 2020 census, its impact on New Yorkers, and redistricting. Joining me today is Dr. Zelima Blair, professor and chair of the Department of Public Administration at Medgar Evers College, CUNY. Thank you so much for joining us. So before we get into the questions that I have for Dr. Blair today, I just want to frame this. The 2020 census is probably one of the most unique censuses in history. Since 1790, every 10 years, the United States has conducted a population count because of Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. It dictates that we must do an enumeration of the population for the purposes of apportionment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means when we get into the questions in a few moments. But that is why we had to do the census during a global pandemic. You're also going to learn why the census is critically important, not just because of the law, but because it's very important for the resources our community receives. More than 300 federal programs are funded based on this data. And again, we're going to get into a little bit more about exactly what this means for New York City. The results were just announced in what we call a legacy format. That is a format that states can use for another process we call redistricting. So listen in for a little while and wait to hear more about what this means for you as an individual. Of course, these terms sometimes we don't really get them as individual New Yorkers. We're going about our business, taking care of our families, but these processes are important to our daily lives. And Dr. Blair is actually going to help us understand why it is important. So our first question for Dr. Blair: did you notice any glaring differences between the 2010 census and the 2020 census results? And I'm asking Dr. Blair this because she's known around the city as one of the census data crunchers. 2020 is not her first rodeo. So tell us, Dr. Blair, did you notice anything different in the preliminary results?
Well, I have a vested interest in looking at what happens to people of African descent. And so what I've noticed is that we've seen a large population shift in terms of people moving from Brooklyn, for instance, to the Bronx. It's not necessarily a decrease in people of African descent throughout New York City, but the movements that has been occurring throughout the city. Also, what I've noticed is that people that have, people of African descent that have traditionally lived in certain neighborhoods, the Bedford-Stuyvesants, the Brownsville, they still live there, they still live in East New York, et cetera, but they're moving more and more to neighborhoods that they have not traditionally had a strong foothold in. So the Williamsburg, the Lower East Side, Chinatown, Crotona Park East, they're moving in these different areas, and that is because we tend to only count Black alone or African Americans. We rarely count multiracial Black, and there's a whole history behind that as part of the whole total population, total Black population, that is. So it may seem like there's this quote unquote 8% decrease in the Black population, but there really isn't. In fact, there's a slight increase when you define who people of African descent are. We also saw that the Bronx population for people of African descent increased significantly. They're now at 39%. So that's a big difference when you look at different ethnicities who shifted. So the Bronx, although they used to have a lot of individuals there, people of African descent, now it's coming back even more, especially in the Tremont area, in the Fordham area. So we're seeing a slight decrease in West Indian populations, which we refer to conglomerately as Caribbean people, but we saw a slight decrease, maybe about 100,000 or so, only because I feel, because of immigration policies maybe, foreclosure, a lot of different issues occurring there. So those are some underlying public policy issues that we tend to overlook, and that really could have a significant impact on the population. Queens, same thing. We see a little bit of movement in terms of going into non-traditional neighborhoods, but the Asian population has significantly skyrocketed throughout New York City, the Sunset Park area, the southwestern part of Brooklyn, on, and throughout New York City. So while New York City's population has increased, what we did see, I'm not sure if it's because of the pandemic, because New York City population sort of peaked around 2016, and then we're just holding on. We saw significant Caucasians leaving New York City. So in every single neighborhood, you can pretty much see white flight in these areas.
Now, I wanted you kind of glossed over it, but I noticed when the results, you know, were announced a couple of weeks ago, they talked about the white population decreasing, but that the second largest population were of 2 or more races. Mm-hmm. That was the second largest. So it was people who picked, and do you think that the change in the questioning between 2010 and 2020 kind of led to this kind of change? And then it kind of was in what you talked about in terms of there's kind of a decrease, but not really a decrease in the Black population.
Oh, certainly. When we use the term quote unquote diversity, this is what we're speaking to. We often just think of it as a one race phenomenon, but no, it's people who identify with more than one race, not just ethnicity, or we're just diversifying the population. We're saying we're putting a Latino here, we're putting a person of African descent here, or Asian person here. No, it's actually people who now have the choice to say, listen, my parents are from Japan and Jamaica, and so I am going to identify with both races, right? My parents are both Black and white, and I want to acknowledge both. And so that's what's happening. But if history has taught us anything, we know that when we have been not been able to self-identify, and people, census takers, have identified for us, that once there was some way that there was a person of African descent in your generation, in somewhere mixed in there, that you were automatically quoted as person of African descent. So, and really and truly going, I know they started working on 2030 already. We should really be advocating for how these questions are worded for our communities. I mean, every other race and ethnicity have done it.
Good. That's a good point. Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that. Getting ready for 2030 already. It starts now. So we talked about, so you touched on that increase in population. So they said that the New York City's population increased by about 600,000, right? And so we talk about the things that impact the census. There was an article in Crain's that said that this is going to mean billions of dollars in federal funding for the city. How else can this increase, you know, because a lot of times people don't understand why they should answer these questions and why the government, you know, wants to know. Tell us, how else can this increase in population that we saw as a result of the census, how can this help us as New Yorkers?
Well, there's a lot of different things. I mean, the federal dollars that we receive, if the COVID money is any indication of it, right? If the money coming from the federal government really sparks a lot of things. One, infrastructure, right? Transportation. We know we're suffering here when a storm like this hits. At any given time, the MTA could be underwater. So infrastructure issues. But for low-income populations and low-income New Yorkers in general, if we're advocating for equity in healthcare, I mean, 60% of Medicaid dollars. If we're advocating for equity in schools, especially public education, there's Title I that's able to level the playing field for all these children, right? That we know Wi-Fi was a big issue in this remote access. So all the low-income individuals could really benefit in this prospect. But I don't want to just say that that's the only factor. If we're talking about parks, if we're talking about the space, more greener space, if we're talking about building or fixing NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority. These are places and fixtures throughout New York City that we can really see, bring New York back. And we saw decreases in the population. We had estimated that the population will go up to 9.1 million. But again, with the inequities that was skyrocketing from COVID, you saw a lot of people leave New York City because they were scared. But now, if history has any indication, they come back. And they will come back if the geographical amenities are there.
Exactly. And I think I saw a story just this week that people are already coming back, to New York City during the recovery. So that's definitely true. I mean, and I just want to add on, programs, Pell Grant, student loans, Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, Head Start,
yes.
All of our emergency services are, these are funded and more, based on census data. So it really helps us having a complete and accurate count. I also want to add that representation in government. So for the first time since the 1950 census, actually, New York was losing 2 congressional seats or more every 10 years due to the census. And so this year, for the first time, we only lost 1 congressional seat since 1940. So while we grew, New York State as a whole grew, I think, at about 4%. We didn't grow as much as other states grew. So we lost 1 congressional seat. So that is an impact, but we were very close to keeping that congressional seat.
And gaining one.
and almost gaining one. So, I just, we also we're going to talk about that after the next question, but I just want to quickly add, was there one borough that saw more growth than any other borough in terms of a percentage of increase in population?
I would say most people say Queens, but the Bronx really skyrocketed.
Okay,
there. And we have to really chalk a lot of those things up to affordable housing. Low income individuals really, and the development that's going on throughout the city. People really moved to these outer boroughs, as they like to call them, because it was there for the taking, and why not? It's still public transportation available. It's still everything well. We saw that there was no real growth, but no real loss for Manhattan. We saw a slight growth for Brooklyn, but Bronx and Queens, I would say, were really neck to neck. But in terms of the types of population that the Bronx got was really exciting, I should say.
So we see where the competition is, as long as Manhattan holds, as long as we hold. And especially with a lot of people, leaving during the pandemic. So yes. I was glad we kind of were able to hold. So I like to call redistricting the after party, to the census. And as educated voter, I'm very passionate about voter education. And some people don't quite understand the relationship. Well, why are you doing anything around the census and voting? And redistricting, and basically it's how we get our electoral representation for the next 10 years. So I think if you want to talk a little bit kind of about, well, we know apportionment, but tell the people what the apportionment process is, right? We touched on the congressional seats, but let's tell them a little more about it. And then I want to know, and I want people to understand how can they get involved in this redistricting process and why they should.
Redistricting is about power for your community. If you wonder why you do not have certain things in your community, or you do have certain things in your community, let's put it that way, it is because there's a lack of advocacy. And so redistricting provides that equal access, that one-to-one vote. One of the main reasons why the census is done is to redistrict, is to apportion the population, because people move for even political reasons, right? People move for economic reasons. We just talked about the affordable housing situation, and people move for social reasons. They want to be closer to their families, et cetera. And so when people move, there's an uneven count. One vote is supposed to be allotted to one person, but that has not been the case, especially for people of color. And in this process of redistricting, for congressional seats, you are allotted 435. So you take that number in New York State, which is approximately 20 million, and you divide it by the number of congressional seats there. So you're apportioning evenly. And so where the magic number that each seat is supposed to be at is 776,000. Now just think, if there are counties upstate versus downstate, who count people upstate moved out of New York or people downstate moved out of New York, and there are certain districts that have far less populations than another populated district, then that individual does not have equal access to their representative. That representative cannot touch those individuals' issues. And that's, we hear from people all the time, oh, I contacted this person and they couldn't get to me. They couldn't get to you because the districts have been unequal. People not filling out their census forms, people not responding. And so the districts have been uneven throughout the decades. In fact, one of the things that state legislature did was make sure that prisoners or people who are incarcerated are counted at their permanent address. So we're waiting on those numbers as well to make sure that, because they all come home, right? Make sure that those numbers are even. So we may not impact the whole district, but a particular census tract as having co-location issues in school, or lack of heat and hot water in their communities, et cetera, or a bus service going out. That could be a big issue that they can't come together and advocate for. So the apportionment numbers are really, really big. In the US Congress, it's 435 seats. You can't go anything above that. And all politics are local. So the same issues that some of us are facing here in New York City, the person in Detroit might be facing that as well. So it's about communities of interest: African-American, West Indian, immigration, housing, transportation, and keeping those communities together and making sure that their voices are not diluted so that they can come together and advocate for their needs. Healthcare needs, right? Having a community-based organization serve pregnant women, having a WIC. That's one of the things that census funds, right? Having a women, infant, and children program in your community that other communities have successfully advocated for. So it's about drawing the geographic lines around these communities to make sure that they are kept together so that there's enough of them that they can speak loudly to their elected officials and make their voices heard. So sometimes they don't get to do that because the boundaries split up different communities and they can't come together and make their voices heard. So organizations such as the Center for Law and Social Justice, such as the Brennan Center, other organizations throughout the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, All Deaf, Latino Justice, they come together to make sure that these things don't happen, that they protect the communities that they represent. So these are some of the ways that you don't have to be an expert. You could just say, you know what? All of my children are split up between different school districts, and I don't understand why. I live across the street from this individual, but their child is zoned for this school, and they have more resources, and I can't put my child in that school. Well, and you can't all mobilize together because you guys may have different elected officials. So your voices are diluted. This redistricting is about the community. Remember, you own the community, not the other way around, not the community own you. So it's your voice. So it is about making sure that you say to whomever the group is that you want to represent, listen, we all go to the same church. We all shop along the same lines. We all shop at 125th Street, so you should not cut this out of our district. We all shop along Fulton Street or Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn, so you should make sure you respect those boundaries. There was a time that Empire Boulevard is a very important boundary in Brooklyn, and there was a time that they crossed those boundaries and split a community, Prospect Lefferts Garden. And so one side of the street was represented by one assembly district, and one side of the street was, and no one was watching because people didn't understand the process. And so when parents wanted to advocate to send their children to the same schools, they couldn't. And so that's a real crucial factor that you have to watch for.
And just before you go on, because I know you know this, that's why I'm asking you the questions, but I want to tell people just the basic definition of redistricting is basically the redrawing of our political districts, our legislative districts. So it's maybe you had a different congressman before and you're wondering why 10 years ago it switched. This is the process that happens after every census. Our congressional district lines will be redrawn, state Senate district, state assembly, and our city council districts. These lines will be redrawn. And what Dr. Blair is saying about communities of interest and making sure that you can advocate together is key. Now, I know you know about this. I'm lobbing you this softball question because I want you to tell people about this. New York has an independent redistricting commission where citizens can participate. I believe they're going to announce, they're drawing the maps and they're going to have some public hearings. What can a citizen, the average citizen, Joe Schmo say, you know what, I want to make sure my community gets together. How can they plug into that process?
Well, first, they could go online to the Independent Redistricting Commission, which they have a YouTube channel. And on the next hearing, I think is coming up September 2nd. So they have markers, they have deadlines. They've done some Zoom videos by boroughs to say participants by each borough. And then after September 15th, when the maps come out, they're going to have more public comment 30 days after September 15th about how these maps look in their different communities. So, put yourself in that map and see where important organizations are in that. So you have to be able to comment or sign up in this process to do so. There are a number of organizations that are also doing community trainings. You could just ask your elected officials. You could ask your local community organizations that represent these different areas. Center for Law and Social Justice is one. Like I said, NYU Brennan Center, they do some as well, NAACP. So if you can contact these local organizations and they could tell you, but your elected officials could tell you as well. They have ways that you can just say, listen, I lived in this community for a certain amount of years and we all participate in this. And it's really about your experience in your community, where you always envision those boundaries, which is really where it's going. You can even participate in the maps, because even if you cannot use the software, you can write the map, write how you want your community to look on paper, right? You could say, no, you should not draw the line here. You should stop this district right here. You should not separate these two neighborhoods. So even if you do not have the skill set to draw a map on a computer software, you can tell it to them in words. But if you go online to the Independent Redistricting Commission, you can see it. And remember, the districts have to be what we call in redistricting language, to keep it simple, compact. That means they should be as close to a square or circle as possible. They should not be zigzagged or looking crazy, because then you know that there's some vote dilution going on. They should be contiguous, right? They have to connect. They should respect the boundaries. I keep stressing this boundary stuff, right? You're gonna say, I don't know what Dr. Blair is saying about these boundaries, but you would know, because everyone knows where the lines of Bedford-Stuyvesant starts. Everyone knows where South Bronx starts. Everyone knows where Harlem begins and ends, right? Everyone knows that there's a difference between Central and East. We know these different things. So if you see that those boundaries are not being respected, you can speak up about it. And the more, the merrier, because every community is organizing.
One of the commissioners who I know pretty well, he even said you could take a crayon. And it's very true. People don't, like the average citizen, that line. I mean, I argue about people where Harlem begins and ends. People go to the mat on that. So yes, we do know. So we know our communities. And I think that's what I wanted people to understand. You do not have to be some sort of sophisticated geographer to participate in the redistricting process. You can say, listen, I know that we are all a community. I had a few people come to me and they actually expressed that, a girlfriend of mine said, well, we have 3 council members. And I said, what? And I said, you need to get in on this redistricting process. Like, why does your community have 3 different council members? How the lines were drawn? And she didn't realize that either. And I said, but this is actually the prime time for you to now say, actually, we need to have one individual representing us because we have these common needs. We are a community together and should not be separated. So just, that was really my last specific question, but do you have any, parting words for our average citizen, about the census and, this redistricting process, which I call the after party?
Yeah, so the community board is a good marker. Community boards are usually whole, and they usually control a lot of different land issues. But if you try to, and they're pretty equal in population to like an assembly district or something, if you try to match up your community board to an assembly district or something along those lines, you're in pretty good shape. If not, your assembly district or your city council district, like Nicole, like you just said, will be divided. And you would say, well, so what? What does that mean? It means a lot if you're advocating for a particular community-based organization to stay open. If only 2 people could go to this city council person, but 20 people could go to this city council person, and there you are on opposite sides, but you're in the same neighborhood, that is a big difference because an elected official pays attention to numbers. So you want your voices heard, and there's power in numbers.
Right, and you want to be together. So make sure
you want to be together. Communities of interest is the name of the game. Keep your communities and your boundaries together.
Perfect. I think that's a great way for us to wrap up, because we definitely, we ran out of time, but I want people to know the website is nyirc.gov to find out about the redistricting process. The census, while we talked about the 2020 census, there are a ton of other surveys the census conducts that impacts our communities in between the one that they do in the years ending in 0. So visit census.gov, census.gov, to learn more about the census and what they do and how the data is actually available to you. Because as we talked about it, we looked at the data, you too can look at the census data and learn more about how your community is changing. So this has been a great episode. I just want to thank, Dr. Blair for joining me tonight. This has been a fantastic discussion about the census, one lively and very informative discussion. I hope you learned something about it. I hope you tell a friend, and definitely get involved in the redistricting process. It is happening right now in New York State. Thank you so much.